again, everybody, and it's nice to see you here. This is a slightly strange sensation around summer school now. This is almost one of the last lectures in the summer school series, and there's a sort of end-of-school feeling around the building. But I'm very happy today to be able to introduce Bill Nasson. I'm sure many of you know Bill and Bill's work already, but he supplied me with a little CV, so I'm going to read it. Bill grew up in Wynberg, where he survived schooling, St. John's Church, and the trauma of adolescence before being educated in Britain at the universities of Hull, York, and Cambridge. He's held visiting fellowships at Cambridge University, the Australian National University, the University of Illinois, the University of Kent in Canterbury, and Trinity College Dublin. He lectured in economic history and in history at the University of Cape Town for many years before moving to Stellenbosch University, from which he has been put out to pasture on his retirement at the end of 2017. So he's just retired, which is what we were discussing. He is an emeritus professor and fellow of UCT and emeritus professor of Stellenbosch University. His books include Abraham Esau's War, Britannia's Empire, the War for South Africa, Springboks on the Somme, and South Africa at War 1939 to 1945. His most recent book is History Matters, Selected Writings 1970 to 2016. Bill's also trustee of the education charity, the Claude Leon Foundation, and is an aging life member of the Peter Cook Appreciation Society. So thanks very much, Bill.
Thanks very much for that. Don't clap.
Put it in your pocket.
Yeah. There.
And then if you just tip it onto your
Push it on there or something, yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. All hear me all right? Yeah. Gosh, this is the graveyard shift. And but there's water. I had a suggestion from friends in Johannesburg saying that we ought to trade in our dogs for goats or camels because they don't need water or green grass. You know. Gosh, yes, war and colonial conquest. That's a sort of lumpy topic for any afternoon, especially late on a Friday. I thought I'd start on a sort of personal note about some of my own history. And let me start with a delicious quote from the novelist E.M. Forster, who wrote many decades ago, "History is so very attractive to the more timid among us. We can recover our self-confidence by snubbing the dead." Some of those people, you know, kind of timid people, cowardly people, and I'll include myself, have written on war, on the whole world of destruction and slaughter. I have never held a gun, let alone fired a gun. Nevertheless, for just over 20 years, about a dozen years at UCT, and about 9 years at Stellenbosch, I've taught a course on war and society to senior undergraduates and to honours students. What did that course consist of? Part of it was sort of abstract or philosophical or anthropological, and it was about the place of war in human history and the place of war in our lives. There is no doubting the centrality of war to human society. War has been universal in our history for the past 100,000 years at least. What has war done for human development? You needn't be a pacifist to agree that war is a bad thing, but can it ever be good or beneficial? There's even a recent book by an Australian historian. Australians, of course, are notoriously contrary, which has a wonderful title, war, what is it good for? Which seeks out to persuade us of the advantages, the benefits of war. So you needn't be a pacifist, as I've said, to agree war is bad. But can it ever be good? Leaving aside Lady Macbeth or our own poisoning Daisy de Melker, why is it men who have done nearly all of the killing? Can one say that some countries or some societies are more warlike, more belligerent than others? And so on. So the course I taught started like this, with these general reflections on the meaning of war. Then we would consider what we might call the cultures or the ways or the practices of war. How wars were waged or prosecuted within particular demographic, environmental, and economic circumstances. And here, of course, there is an enormous range to consider. If we take, for instance, the islands of the Pacific, they have had and have tiny populations and limited resources. So the wars there were always fought with restraint, with agreed rules of how to fight them. The object was very rarely to kill people, but to capture them, to take them as labor, or to enslave them, because the source of wealth was human life. So those were wars which preserved life. The famous American anthropologist Margaret Mead went into the Pacific in the 1920s to study what became known as the flower wars of Polynesia, where people would fight with hydrangeas or roses or gladioli, other kinds of soft flowers which would not hurt people. And those were wars where warriors went out with their roses or their gladies to fight these ritual contests until one person subdued, the other, one person yielded or surrendered, and that brought the war to an end. Or they would be fighting with sticks. You'll know that phrase, running amok. The wars which were fought on the Indonesian island of Java. So those, in a way, were soft wars or nice wars, things you would fight in a primary school playground. On the other hand, there were places with expanding resources, high fertility, growing populations. What one historian has called people-rich places and countries, like Europe in the early 20th century. So Europe could afford slaughter on a mass scale. The obvious example, of course, is the Great War, followed by the Second World War, wars which in a sense consumed people, ate them, obliterated them. And why could it do this? There were lots of people. The nation state had the capacity to conscript people, and you could conscript them by replacing the dead with the next lot in terms of age. So you could conscript more and more deeply into populations to replace age groups. And that, of course, produced the merciless logic of the First World War. If we take Serbia for a quick example, by 1918, 46% of Serbian men between the ages of 16 and 35 were dead. used to tell undergraduates that and they'd shiver, because they'd say, you were dead. Then we moved from ways of war, looking at these, the sort of conduct of war, to types or kinds of war, and then drawing really on examples from the modern period. So the first of these wars we looked at, of particular relevance for us this afternoon or early evening, were what we might call imperial war, the wars of colonial conquest, our parts of the world, the Anglo-Zulu War, the Anglo-Boer or South African War. In other words, small wars or big small wars of an age of imperial expansion and conquest. Then, in this course, War and Society, we looked at mass industrial war, or what people call total war. Obviously, the world wars, which had a global reach, which had profound depths of mobilization, and which touched every corner of the life which the war affected. There are lots of examples of that. For instance, by 1915, French primary school children in the Somme were visiting reserve trench lines in school parties, were leaving their schools in little groups, in their classes, to do art projects on the war that was being fought a few miles from their classrooms. Sort of brings to mind Leon Trotsky's famous observation. You may not be interested in this war, but the war is very interested in you. Then we looked at civil war, like, for instance, the Spanish Civil War of 1936-39, wars fought without quarter at a ferocious pitch, where violence was answered with violence. In other words, wars which were not fought for a country, but about or over the idea of a country. Here again, it's good to draw on a quote, and the one I've always loved is from the famous BBC war correspondent John Simpson, who distinguished between what he called normal war or regular war and civil war. He said, in a normal war, your country chooses you. In a civil war, you choose your country. Now, while the approach of my now departed, now retired, now late War and Society course was deliberately international in its focus, we always included South African case studies or examples. And when it came to readings, to recommended literature for the students who took that, many of the most enthralling extracts, observations, snatches of material came from the publications of the Riebeeck Society, up to as recently as last year. Then one could cite a resolute, dignified, and poignant declaration from the 2017 selections from the letters of President M.T. Steyn, co-edited by the obscure historian sitting to my right, Elizabeth van Heyningen, and Chris van der Merwe. Take that, fully aware of the odds stacked against the Boer Republican states, Steyn informed the Orange Free State Volksraad in September 1899. Don't think that I think rashly about this matter. I know what it is for two weak republics to fight against the most powerful empire the world has ever known. But I know that if it should come to a war, we would fight for the right of existence of the Afrikaner nation. Here was a distinctively clear-eyed witness to history. Now, it goes virtually without saying that a considerable number of the Society's volumes published over the past century deal either squarely with military episodes, such as the Eastern Cape frontier wars or land wars, or contain arresting material, observations, ideas related to South Africa's national experience of war. Here, just to lift out another random example, we could take another more recent Van Riebeeck Society record, one dealing with the writings of the ANC's president in the 1940s, a great shower, a torrent really, of speeches, letters, petitions, and so on. In the 2012 volume, A.B. Xuma, Autobiography and Select Works, Xuma's insistence on the training and arming of Africans for combat service in the Second World War is somehow simultaneously blunt and moving. As he proclaimed in a 1942 presidential address, Africans are not fighting a war of color. They are fighting a war of ideology. They are fighting Nazism, fascism, and dictatorship wherever it shows its head, externally or at home. We hope that common sense will prevail over the obsolete, irrational, and blind sentiments and prejudices which throughout the length and breadth of South Africa are her arch enemies, preventing the full use of her human resources. If South Africa is betrayed and lost, the Africans, as always, will not be among the traitors. Now, this is perhaps as good a point as any. I've always wanted to sort of bring Adolf Hitler into, or to start lectures with Adolf Hitler. Never been able to do that because of what I taught. I have a publishing friend in London who told me many decades ago, in the 70s, that, and he worked for Longmans, the publisher, he said, if they could put Adolf Hitler's face on the front cover of every book they published, fiction or non-fiction, they would do it, because it would triple the sales automatically, irrespective of the content. So it's a sort of lure of the Führer. So, given that Xuma was talking about Hitler, let me just bring in Adolf Hitler a little bit at this point. I mean, he's no stranger to the topic of war and conquest. Now, as a great colonial power, Hitler admired Britain. In fact, in the 1920s and 1930s, the British World Empire had no greater admirer than the German leader. Interestingly, Hitler and other German imperialists around him explained Britain's position as a world power in generally the same way that many historians would explain it today. Access through its colonies or its dependencies to supplies of fertile land overseas and access to supplies of vital commodities like gold and control of markets in Asia and Africa enabled the British to overcome the tight jacket of the limited resources of their own damp and tiny little island. With these assets under their belt, the British could become specialists in industrial production, produce a massive amount, make immensely fat profits, become a military superpower, and become a world power. Now, German imperialists, like Adolf Hitler, were also fond of emphasizing what they saw as another admirable British element. What the British were like as colonists, as they saw them. In the German view, the British had the right character for colonial conquest. They had discipline, they had energy, and they had ruthlessness. The British in India, for instance, had enormous energy and initiative. A small number of individuals could conquer and run a massive subcontinent. The British were able to dominate North America, Australia, East Africa, Southern Africa. They had power and purpose. They sent out self-reliant bands of white settlers with strong stomachs. They were not squeamish about expelling or subduing savages. Savages they found to be living in the way. It was essential to clear them away, to colonize the land for themselves. War and conquest was the price to be paid in order to claim new lands. After all, hostilities, clashes were part of the great chain of being, the march of progress. So, German imperialists in the 19th and earlier 20th centuries applauded the ways in which the British were building their new empire and were consolidating the benefits of their new white settler colonies. You know, establishing civilization, dressing for dinner in the bush, remembering to serve port from the left, and so on. In the years before the 1890s and Das Burenkrieg, the Boer War at the end of the century, you can in a way just imagine these high officials, these diplomats, in the Kaiser's colonial office in Berlin. You can kind of imagine the Kaiser himself, who was a pretty ridiculous figure. I mean, for example, he was an honorary colonel of a Scottish regiment. And he liked to walk around Berlin in a kilt. He also liked to smack the bums of visiting dignitaries and diplomats, which was his idea of a joke, of being humorous. But the Kaiser had an obsessive anxiety of being left behind by Britain. And Britain was by then recognized as the world's supreme, the best example of modern colonial settlement. Now, the Germans were especially interested in two places. One was Australia. That was a model place. There, the British were complete pioneers. There, the Aboriginal population had been exterminated. That was part of the necessary elimination of inferior races. It was unprofitable to leave them to continue to exist. And of course, as I dare say, many of you will know, in the early 1900s, the Germans turned to their own eradication in southwest Africa with the Nama-Herero genocide. In the words of a couple of historians a few years ago, what they called the Kaiser's Holocaust. The other interesting place which interested these Germans, was the eastern frontier of South Africa, earlier in the 19th century. Now, here in South Africa, towards the southeast, conditions were not like Australia, circumstances were different. There, the savages existed in larger numbers. There, Africans were resilient. They were no pushover. They were able to put up stiff resistance. Yet, the British, despite their relatively small numbers, were able to overcome and to impose their colonial peace. How did they do that? That was the question which intrigued the colonial mandarins of Berlin. Now, these mandarins, they had a set of answers, and some of them were quite perceptive. Firstly, the Germans noted that British soldiers in South Africa were greatly outnumbered by African adversaries. Why did they not do the natural thing? To break ranks and to run away. Why? Because the British knew about drill, about regimental discipline, and there was the element of fear. You would not be taken prisoner, you would not be fed and watered if you were caught by your enemy. It was kill or be killed. Secondly, the British exploited technology and superior weaponry of their industrial revolution. They could compensate for their small numbers, make up for it with disciplined firepower. Thirdly, the British were refreshingly modern in the view of these German observers. In other words, they didn't fight in old-fashioned ways. They didn't fight seasonally according to the cycles of the climate. Climate is not something one wants to consider in Cape Town right now. But the point was they knew that to win in the Eastern Cape, they needed to carry the war deeply into the economy of their opponents. So they used the professionalism of their soldiers. They were being fed, they were being clothed, they were being paid. There was no need for them to stop a war to reap crops. So, wait. Just ahead of the harvest season, burn crops, destroy fields, deny the enemy food, and erode their morale. In later decades, at the end of the 1870s, Sir Garnet Wolseley planned a campaign around exactly that. Defeat the Zulu by attacking their food stores, driving off their cattle, slaughtering their herds. And of course, we know all too well the fate of the Boer republics, with scorched earth just a couple of decades later, when the Boers found themselves in the position of being lighter-skinned versions of the Xhosa and the Zulu. Fourthly, the Germans liked the way in which the British exploited the weaknesses and the divisions within the camp of their African enemies. Or to put it another way, the British adopted the advice of the ancient Chinese philosopher of war, Sun Tzu. In his The Art of War, he personified war as a river which sort of rolls along across the land. But then it rolls up against a wall. And how do you get the river past a wall? You find out where the weak stones are. You use spies. You make little tracks. You entice opponents to join you. You lure them into your camp. Or you find out who their enemies are. In that classic thing, you make your enemy's enemy your friend. You employ them as collaborators. So, prime example, in the Eastern Cape frontier or land wars of the 1830s, the Amafengu, the so-called Fingos, who sided with the colonial interest. Colonial warfare carried out on this basis was exactly what the Kaiser and his circle imagined should be put into practice by their own country. On the other hand, southeastern South Africa wasn't entirely a rosy picture. In a way, the British were too successful here at war and colonial conquest. Between the 1820s and the 1860s, left to themselves, Germans were emigrating in enormous numbers. Mostly, of course, to America, but some of them were going to other places, in smaller numbers, but to places which were British. As the Gesellschaft für deutsche Kolonisation moaned, even if only a handful of German immigrants were heading for the frontier districts of the Eastern Cape, that was hardly serving the interests of Germany and German colonialism. German farmers, traders, missionaries were being swallowed up with what the Gesellschaft called the partition of the earth. Deutschtum in South Africa's Cape was disappearing into foreign races or foreign blood that was flowing into the colonized districts of the Eastern Cape. So, that was the view of the Eastern Cape frontier or land war experiences from the distant Kaiserreich of Berlin. Another view would be that of a different witness to history. For a more close-up, worm's eye account of these decades, you could turn to one of the notable Riebeeck Society memoirs published, one of the earlier ones, published in 1946. The Chronicle of Jeremiah Gould, Albany settler of 1820. Now, that chronicle is not that of a top dog official or of a military commander in Grahamstown. It is the vivid record of an ordinary English artisan with little formal education. And much of it deals with the running wars, the running scraps between British settlers and Africans. It is candid and unflinching. It depicts the horror of minor skirmishes, constant hostilities. In one searing account, Swain relates how a group of men went out in search of a man, John Armstrong. He'd gone missing. So they went out, hoping against hope that they would find him alive. Swain writes, "But alas, poor man, poor man. He found he had fallen among murderers. He must have defended himself most desperately, for several of his fingers were broken, and his arms were much bruised, and also his head. Several assegai wounds were found on his body. One or more had gone straight through his heart." Now, what does this kind of description provide? Clearly, not a casualty statistic, a factual loss to be entered into some balance sheet of white lives lost in the 6th or the 7th Xhosa War, nor is it a contribution to blame, to who was right or who was wrong in these frontier struggles. Nor, I think, is it something to be paraded as proof of the inherent depravity or barbarism of tribal warriors. Somehow, it's more of a sort of emotional mist or haze, touching on the universal instinct of pity. In a way, it reminds me of something I read in the 1970s by the American historian John Womack, who wrote on the Mexican Revolution, Zapata. Remember that wonderful Marlon Brando movie with the white horse on the cliff top? And also wrote about Bolivian mine workers. So Womack was very interested in the lives, in the histories of people who were underdogs. What did Womack say? And it's a quote I've used for many years with students. "It seems to me that teaching about pain, creating empathy, getting people to understand that everybody bleeds, is really the only important thing that history can do. Literature can do that too, but literature is really ultimately about the imagination. History tries to be about reality, what really happened. So it's a way of enlightening us that people who really lived went through danger and suffering, which would have affected us as badly now as it affected them back in history. And of course, as John Womack stressed those 40-odd years ago, it is in the cruelty and carnage of war that we can fully understand frailties and miseries. Now, in the century covered by the historical documents, which are the sort of the spur for this week's series, South Africa has experienced its fair share and more of what in commonplace daily vocabulary we would refer to as war. As in many other parts of the world, such hostilities might be distinguished between what we might call active wars and passive wars. Active war arose as defined periods of armed conflict with organized acts of direct physical violence, what political scientists would call hot war. Here, in our country that hot war could encompass a range of conflicts. Self-evidently, the South African War of 1899-1902, the invasion of German Southwest Africa in the First World War, and the border war of the 1980s. In addition, of course, there's the great peppering of rebellions and insurrections and uprisings which have pockmarked this country. The Bambatha Rebellion in Natal, 1906, for instance, the Afrikaner Rebellion of 1914-15, the Rand Revolt of 1922, the Ponderland Revolt of the 1950s, and so on. Passive war, or as some would term it, Cold War, was triggered by the use of threat and counter-threat, with very little actual fighting and relatively negligible mortality. So that represents a period of constant anxiety, fear, and threat. Globally, and again most obviously, the world endured this between 1945 and 1989. And this kind of phobia, international phobia, has been reinvented in our current times as the war against terrorism or the war on terror. For the latest war on this or that threatening horde, you could check President Donald Trump's Friday evening tweet before you have your dinner later tonight. As with the Roman Empire or the British Empire, there's really no standing still with places which have had or still have a mentality of expansion, conquest of some kind. Either they keep flexing their muscles, pushing outwards, or they sink beneath the swarm of barbarians massing on the frontier. Now, although, as I'm sure we all know, to our cost, we live in a small fry country, a sort of 5-foot country. And despite South Africa's modest place in the world, it still escaped the happy fate of being a warm hunter-gatherer civilization or a cold country with cuckoo clocks. Still, South Africa is a place of extreme paradox when we think about war. On the one hand, compared with 20th century Europe, it has been a remarkably safe and peaceful place. Let's discount, if you will, our stratospheric annual murder rate. And granted, there have been the death rates from AIDS in recent decades and from the Spanish flu at the end of the First World War. The chair of the Riebeeck Society, Howard Phillips, is the bee's knees on that topic. But South Africa has not, in modern history, been a place in which war has been a major threat to human well-being and livelihood. The country has been spared the European horrors of the 2 world wars or the genocides of Europe. Equally, not only has it known war, it also likes the language of war, especially engaging in this country's many passive wars rather than hot wars. And here there's an incredibly long list. I gave up trying to rack up those wars. The wars against communism decades ago, atheism, witchcraft, drugs, crime, rhino poaching, corruption, water wastage very recently. And there's also the South African fondness for invoking war, brandishing it rhetorically, making a fuss with the imagery of war. So once upon a time, Winnie Mandela was entering or leaving what were called the trenches on a daily basis. That infantry duty seems to have been taken on by Julius Malema and the EFF, addicted to storming out of the trenches into the no-man's land of Sandton Square before overrunning the mannequins of H&M. This attraction of the idea of war as something dramatic or exciting rather than hideous makes it all the more important that we remember what war is and what it means, and that we try to understand it through the testimony of those who have viewed it, lived it, been damaged by it, and survived it. And I think this is especially so because central to the history of this country since the beginning of the 20th century is a major type of modern war. And it's quite interesting to think of this in a sort of abstract way, sort of boil it down to basics. What is that kind of modern war which is central to the making of the South Africa we live in today? It is the war of the pitched battle, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is a war with distinctive, recognizable winners and losers. It is a conflict which is limited in time, not simmering along, flaring up, dying down over a period of many years. At the same time, although such wars may be limited in their duration, they are often less limited in the destruction that they can cause. Historical anthropologists have a nice name for wars of this type, and the nice name is deliberately, slyly ironic or semi-ironic. These are the wars of civilized societies, which is to say that these wars emerged around 5,000 years ago and accompanied the rise of territorial states. These were the wars of the Greeks, the Romans, the Turks, the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, the British, the Americans, and so on. Over time, they have involved empires, monarchies, and republics. They all have starting and ending dates, such as 1870, 71, Franco-Prussian War, 1914-18, 1939-45. And be it not overlooked, 1899, 1902. All of these wars begin on one day and end on another day. Within the period of the war, the fighting is often more total, more ferocious than in even brutal, smaller colonial wars. They are fought to defeat and often to conquer another state with a fixed center of political power or capital, unlike most traditional peasant societies. This frequently involves large-scale destruction to break the will of an enemy which is stubborn and won't surrender. And it is not uncommon for such wars to bring intense civilian suffering and disease. Lastly, such war is not associated with the symbolic reasons for low-level spluttering war or feuding or rivalry between what might be called tribal or so-called pre-civilized societies. Honor, shame, manliness, pride, revenge, insults. Instead, civilized wars are associated with fear and with greed. The enemy poses a threat, so attack them before they attack you. This is the contemporary world of fear, the accumulation of arms and preemptive strikes. The second motive is greed. Part of that is greed for power. A successful war, either in attack or in defense, can boost your political power and silence your critics. Another is greed for resources or position that can be secured decisively only through conquest. This takes us, by way of conclusion, to the very obvious local example of South Africa's biggest war of civilized societies, the South African War of 1899-1902. Now, it's an exceptionally complicated war, and a war of contrasting meanings. For Britain, for instance, the South African War was an unexpectedly big war of colonial conquest, but it was still an aggressively big-small war. For the Republican Boers, it was a war for survival, for existence. The war here was also a war about big ideas: justice, morality, religion, proper conduct, credibility. And it was also a war about human irony. You know, the South African War, or the Anglo-Boer War, in a way is like all wars, a sort of perfect expression of the rule or the aphorism of the cultural critic Paul Fussell, American cultural critic, who wrote a very famous book decades ago called The Great War and Modern Memory. And one of the things he said in that book is that all wars are ironic, or all wars are contradictory. Why? Because those who begin a war will always find that the war they have got is not the war they expect. It's never going to be over by Christmas. It's never going to be over in 6 months. If you want to discover that a war you may have thought was familiar is actually less familiar than you thought, I want to end by recommending that you devour the notable society volumes dealing with this conflict. For example, the 2001 War Diary of Burger Jack Lane, 1899 to 1900, if you want a taste of what it was like for a reluctant, foot-dragging Burger Commando conscript who was not a proper regular Boer. The 1995 War Memoirs of Commandant Ludwig Krause, 1899 to 1900, will give you a sensitive taste of, from the inside, of how Boer Command was running the war. The 1987 Breaker Morant and the Bushveld Carbineers will provide you with a fascinating definitive treatment of a roughneck Australian rubbing up the British Empire in the issue over the conduct of war. That, I think, is a good point for me to stop droning on, a good point on which to end. Australians, unlike South Africans, have rarely been ambivalent about having to fight in Britain's wars. It's not for nothing that the South African Australian Donald Denoon once called the Australians the white Gurkhas of the British Empire. Right, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, well, yes, indeed.
The whole point of the European Union was to prevent war.
Was to prevent war. No, exactly. Yeah, no.
And that was introduced them to Jeremiah Gould, Swain, so they knew who he was.
Oh, good. Okay. Yes.
Will you take some
I'll take some questions. Yeah, sure. Oh, no, in fact, that's one of the... It's interesting about wars that are familiar and unfamiliar. Because that is quite a... In fact, not in the Second Anglo-Boer War, in the First Anglo-Boer War, 1880-81, they did wear these ridiculous coats. It's a complicated thing about colour. I mean, the French, if you think of the French army in the First World War, the French army started out in bright blue and red. Because if you didn't go out as a poilu, if you didn't go out as a patriotic, brave, masculine Frenchman displaying your colours to the Germans, you were considered to be inferior. So they were simply basically sort of target practice, at the beginning of the First War, before they adapted and started wearing khaki. So what happens when the British were here on the Highveld is that the officers would sort of wear their medals and shiny brass buttons, and that's very nice in the Highveld sun because it would glitter, and they discovered that they were being picked off by Boer marksmen with their Mausers. So they ended up rubbing horse dung over the buttons, trying to make them as dull as possible. So it was but kind of learning as you went along. Yes, and getting the backs, yes, that's right. And yes, Tommy Atkins and Roy Necker and all of that stuff.
I'm a German, yeah. I'm very good in German history. And I'm a little bit in doubt about your comments on Mr. Hitler. Because I've never heard that this guy actually had some aspiration to conquer Africa. He was an imperialist, but his topic was form on a round, which means people without space.
Oh yeah, no, it wasn't. No, I agree. It wasn't about
Eastern Europe.
Yes, no, I agree. It was,
Inferior people, they to be conquered.
It was Anschluss and Ost.
Ukrainians, Russia.
Of course, yes.
But, I mean, despite the fact that he did that, he said that, okay, I know that Rommel went to